Welcome to a special year-end episode of The Catch-Up, a podcast from The Daily Catch where we take you inside the news. My name is Walter Mullin, and I'm the publisher of The Daily Catch.
And I'm Emily Sachar, the editor and founder of The Daily Catch.
In today's show, we're taking a look back at the year in news for 2025, talking about three of our top news stories, and for the first time ever, Emily, we'll be announcing our Newsmaker of the Year.
We sure will.
This is going to be a good show. Are you ready to catch up?
I am ready, Walter. Let's get into it.
So before we jump in, Emily, do you know what happened on Friday, March 14th of this year?
I didn't know we were going to have a question from you. That's exciting. What happened, Walter? What was it?
On Friday, March 14th, you and I sat down in front of the microphones to record our first episode of The Catch-Up in the studio at Radio Free Rhinecilff. And I remember you saying to me, let's see how this goes and let's see how many people want to listen to us. Well, now today we're doing episode number 36. So I think we're doing pretty well, and we have a lot of listeners.
That's right. And remember, Walter, at that time, we weren't even sure if we could sustain a weekly show, right? That was our ambition, but we didn't start out that way. And then we started to realize, oh my God, we have at least one, sometimes two, sometimes three news stories a week. So
right.
It's an exciting moment for us.
Great. So before we jump in and talk about some of those big news stories, let's just look back to what we accomplished in 2025. Just very quickly, we added a third reporter. We started producing videos to accompany our written stories, and we launched this podcast. And your team wrote a lot of news stories, Emily. Do you have an exact count of how many stories we have published in 2025?
Yes, we published, I just looked at this the other day. We have published through last night 613 stories. So that's almost 52 weeks. So let's call it 50 weeks. So we've been publishing on average more than 10 stories a week throughout 2025.
Fantastic. So we won't have time to talk about all 613 stories, but let's pick three that really stood out this year and kind of look back and talk about them. So our first story of the year won't come as a surprise to anyone listening because it's the story that everyone's been talking about and everyone continues to talk about. The story is the takeover of the Red Hook Boat Club by eminent domain. So let's start by turning the clock back. On March 31st, we published our first story when the town of Red Hook contacted the boat club to discuss, quote, a potential acquisition or private-public partnership. Did you have any idea then, Emily, that this story would come to dominate our news cycle for the year?
I did not. I think on one hand, however, I knew that this was going to be incredibly controversial. And the reason I knew that is that I have over the years met people from the boat club, and I know how deeply, closely held they feel to that institution. You know, Walter, it's not a big place. It occupies, I think, about 650 linear feet along the Hudson River. Doesn't have a huge number of members. I think it's about 200 members, something like that. And there aren't even that many people with boats there, ironically. It's about 35% of the membership have boats. But if you're a member of that boat club, you feel a tremendous affinity for the water. You feel a tremendous passion for the legacy of tradition of your family members. Some of these members have been in that boat club for 3 generations. And I knew that this was going to be a wallop when it was announced. I knew it was going to really excite a lot of people, and it has. And you know, Walter, you know how you see those little election signs, those little yard signs that are put up around election time? Well, of course, we have hundreds of those signs all around Red Hook and even in parts of Rhinebeck talking about, is the town going to take your property by eminent domain? Well, those have outlived the March 31st, the April. We're in December, and those signs are still up and still being put up. We also have these large signs around town that are much bigger banners that have gone up opposite Town Hall. They've gone up on Route 9G. There's one up at the Claremont border. So these are signs, signals of how passionate this topic has been for people.
So I have many people who come to visit who don't live here who see these signs and ask me about them. Why do you think this topic has engulfed and inflamed the community the way it has?
I think there are several reasons, and I'd be curious what you think too, Walter. I think on one hand, it's about the idea of power, the idea that government, which we often think of as protecting the people or having the charge to protect and support and nurture a community, this town board in Red Hook is perceived, I'm not talking about by us, I'm talking about by the populace, as doing something that is not in the public interest. Now, I think we can say, Walter, that the people who run our town and who have voted for this, and it has been a 3-2 vote, I believe Robert McKeon really does believe in his heart that this is the right thing for the town of Red Hook. He knows, I believe, that it's extremely controversial. Obviously, how could he not? There were 565 people who spoke out at a public hearing in the early part of the summer. But I think he believes that over time, when he's long gone, if this is successful, that people will be grateful to have a park, a public park on the Hudson River, right? That said, I think that the people of the town who have been voicing their opposition really believe that in this moment that we live in today, they don't want to see this action taken now, right? So we have kind of the future of Red Hook in McKeon's mind playing against the present of Red Hook. And I think it scares people. The idea that the government can come in and take private property for what many people feel is not an essential service or an essential idea. Is it essential to have a road that runs from west to east in a certain quarter? Maybe yes. Is it essential to have a park on the Hudson River in the town of Red Hook? Many people believe it is not essential. What do you think, Walter? What are you hearing?
I think you summed it up beautifully. I think it's perceived as government overreach, and I think a lot of people are pushing back on it for that reason. I want to talk a little bit more about the public hearings. There have been several, and we've covered all of them, and you've been at most of them. Can you tell listeners what you remember hearing and seeing firsthand at some of those meetings?
Yeah, so I think two in particular come to mind. And let's also note that even when there haven't been public hearings, there has been public comment at virtually every town board meeting since this broke. So those first few minutes of the town board meeting are allotted over to public comment, and the public is allowed to give remarks of up to 3 minutes apiece. And this is the topic that has been on the lips of folks, that's a term that Robert McKeon uses, I should note, since March. Now, there are two hearings in particular, or two moments that come to mind. One is the formal public hearing at which the eminent domain was discussed. And as I just alluded to, there were 565 people who crowded the Red Hook High School auditorium. And Walter, it was a sight unlike anything I've seen. The number of people standing, the number of people sitting with large groups of family members, the children who spoke up, who were concerned, the lawyer for the boat club who spoke up, Mr. Hurst, the pointing at the air, the anger in the air, the number of candidates for town board who were walking around. It was an impression. It was powerful. I've never in my journalistic career, which has run for over 40 years, I have never seen anything like that in my life. I've just never seen it. That kind of groundswell of support, that passion of an entire community. I mean, let's count the number of people in Red Hook. There's 11,400 people who live in Red Hook. 565 people turned out for this thing, right? Now, granted, some were not from Red Hook. If you count the number of adults in the community, that's 10%, almost 10% of the adults turned out for that public hearing. There was another night very early on when 100 people packed into town hall. I think there are seats in town hall for about 60 people. We had standing room only. We had people out in front of the building. We had one person at that meeting, if I recall, Walter, who spoke in support and of the Boat Club eminent domain action. And that night was telling because it showed the shape, the contour of this discussion. It showed the kinds of people who were going to be arguing against it. And I remember that one as well for very different reasons because it was new. And I hadn't seen that recently either. We did have during the discussion, I believe it was in 2021, the discussion over short-term rentals. Those meetings, but they were held on Zoom, were very well attended, hundreds of people, or more than 100 people, I should say. This was different because we were in person, we were live, we were at the microphone, we were an array of town board members up on the dais. It was powerful, Walter. It was powerful.
So we're now 9 months into the Boat Club story. The wheels of town government continue to turn, and the wheels of litigation continue to turn. There are at least 2 or 3 lawsuits filed by the Boat Club making their way through the courts. Looking ahead to 2026, Emily, where do you see this story going? Where do you expect it's going to go in the coming year?
Well, we're going to have an interesting change in leadership in January. 2 new members of the town board will be sworn in. And Robert McKeon will lose his 5-0, his typical 5-0 majority, I believe. Now, we'll have to see. But it is possible that the 2 people who will be coming into the town board, Kenny Migliarelli, a farmer, and Christina Ducharme, an architect, both of whom have expressed disagreement with the town board's approach on eminent domain, it is possible that they will be able to sway perhaps Jacob Testa and command that subject take a different approach. It's possible. We don't know. Right now, it still looks to be a 3-2 majority. So on the voting side and on the legislative choice and option side, it's possible we will see change. We also will see decisions in court cases that may, again, turn back this plan by the supervisor and the 2 other members of town board. So we're going to have to see, and I don't have a crystal ball, but it's going to be a very interesting year, I believe.
So that's a good transition to take us on to our second story of the year, one that is linked to the Boat Club. This story is about the Democratic caucus in Red Hook. Can you start by giving us a recap of what happened with the caucus this year?
Yes. So let's note that in November, we elected 2 new members to the town board in Red Hook. And Red Hook has a caucus system, or has had until now, to elect candidates to run for office on the Democratic ticket. Now, Red Hook is primarily a Democratic town. 48% of registered voters are Democrats. 26% or so are independents, and 21% are Republicans. So, as we often see in elections, the people who are selected at that caucus will typically get elected in the general election. So the caucus was a very important event, and the first Democratic caucus was held on May 31st, and it attracted many, many people. Hundreds of people came to that caucus. But then something happened. The caucus results were thrown out. They were thrown out because the caucus was not properly noticed. They were thrown out on a technicality, one might say. Nonetheless, the caucus had to be reheld, and it was reheld on July 20th. Now, that first caucus was controversial for other reasons as well. 2 candidates, the 2 I just mentioned, Kenny Migliarelli and Christina Ducharme, concerned that they might not be elected to be the standard bearers for the Democratic Party, also put themselves up as independents in a party called Homegrown Red Hook. They wanted to make sure that they had a line on the ballot. Important because Kenny Migliorelli was not even a registered Democrat. So although he could run as a Democrat, he could not go to the caucus, and he did not feel comfortable or confident that he would necessarily win. And in fact, when the second caucus was held, he only came through by 6 votes. So these caucuses were important, but so was the fact that you can nominate through petition. What happened, the controversial moment, was moments before, or hours, really days, just a few days before that May 31st caucus, one member of the town board who has voted in the majority with Robert McKeon all year on the town board, the deputy supervisor, Bill Hammoud, challenged the petitions, the nominating petitions for that independent party. So that whole thing got thrown into chaos as well. So we ended up with 2 candidates for the Democratic Party. Christina and Kenny both made it in the Democratic caucus, both times, in the Democratic caucus number 1 in May and in the Democratic caucus number 2 in July. And they also made it successfully onto the ballot under the petition of Homegrown Red Hook. So they pulled in a lot of votes in November. They easily won. There was one Republican candidate, and they will, as I just explained, be nominated, or they will be, I should say, sworn in to office in January.
Let's go back to the caucus for just a moment. We saw people abandoning their Republican voting identity and shifting to Democratic in order to participate in the caucus. So national politics is divisive between Democrats and Republicans, but local politics can be different. And seeing these people switch their party affiliation was very, very interesting. What do you think about that?
I'm so glad you raised that, Walter, because that is indeed a very interesting aspect of politics, I think in both Red Hook and Rhinebeck. You know, you and I have discussed this. I think what we see in local government is not so much the importance of Republican or Democrat, although I just went through and explained the Democratic caucus in some detail. It has to do with two big ideas: insiders and outsiders. This idea that people want to be part of the process. They want to be on the inside. They don't want to think that, oh, because they're a Republican, they can't participate. So I think that is one of the main reasons that we saw dozens and dozens of voters who were Republicans switching their party affiliation to Democratic in the caucus. This is I think we would call it a loophole that exists legally in state law. And in fact, Robert McKeon used to be a Republican and switched to becoming a Democrat. So we see people able in a certain window to switch their party affiliation. And that window is between the Democratic primary or the party primary and a certain moment in July. And in that moment in Red Hook, as I said, many people switched because they wanted to be able to vote. And we saw many people from the boat club who have told me they were registered as Republicans or they were registered as no party, meaning independents, wanting to vote in that caucus. So they declared themselves Democrats. Now, whether they will switch their party affiliation back, I don't know. And there's another issue, I think, Walter, in play here, which is the idea of clarity and transparency against opacity, or the opaque notion. And I think what we saw as an issue in politics in Red Hook, which I haven't heard really discussed at the national level, is the importance of transparency. People want to understand where their party leaders are and why. They don't just want them to have a specific take on an issue. They want to know, why do you have that take on the issue? Explain yourself. Talk to the people. Go around. It's a very tactile kind of politics that we see playing out in Red Hook.
So as we talked about, two new board members will be sworn in January. So all eyes will be on the town board next year to see if there's a shift in dynamic, a shift in tone, and we'll be there to cover it. Let's move on. Let's move to our third and final story of the year. We're going to jump over to Rhinebeck, where, no surprise, it's also about politics. In this case, though, Emily, it's not necessarily one particular story about politics that caught our attention. It's sort of a collection of little things that have happened mostly in the past few months. Just paint a picture for us about what happened in Rhinebeck and what is going on there at the moment.
Yeah, so I believe you are alluding to the upcoming primary, again on the Democratic side, for village board. So in Rhinebeck, environmentalist Vanessa Bertozzi, a very well-liked member of the village board and a very effective member of the village board, if I might say, has decided to not seek another term. After 4 terms, the terms are for 2 years in Rhinebeck, she's decided not to continue on. And we will now see an election, a Democratic primary at the end of January, on January 27th. 3 candidates. We have Eleanor Pupko, the incumbent. She's only been on the board for 1 term, but she's the incumbent, running against 2 new political upstarts. Mimi Jo Carnella, who is the appointed heir that Vanessa Bertozzi would like to see on the village board, and a woman named Jennifer Neufeld, who is also new to the campaign trail. Now, we are hearing that the Democratic Club in Rhinebeck, which is not to be confused with the Democratic Committee, is supporting, not that they're endorsing, but they are carrying petitions for both Eleanor Pupko and Jennifer Neufeld. So in Rhinebeck, similar to Red Hook, one needs to get signatures to appear on the primary ballot. So we are seeing that all 3 candidates now have sufficient number of signatures, and we will have to see how that plays out. But again, it's an interesting case, not so much of Democrats and Republicans, although we have a Democratic primary system in Rhinebeck, but of desire to participate. And we've seen the shift in the last year alone. We used to have 54% of the registered voters in Rhinebeck were Democrats. Now it's up to 58%. And I think what we're seeing there is, again, an understanding and acknowledgement that with only 15% of the voters Republicans, if you want to participate in politics in Rhinebeck, you need to register as a Democrat, because that's where the action is going to take place in the primary moment. And those are the candidates who ultimately will win election in the general elections. So we'll have a very interesting primary there. Now, you asked about the issues. The issues that are shaping the races in Rhinebeck seem to be focused on this dissension that we've seen playing out between the town government and the village government. It sort of started earlier this year, Walter, with an idea put on the table by the town board led by Supervisor Elizabeth Spinzia to raise a hotel tax, an occupancy tax. And this was something with which members of the village board in Rhinebeck Village took offense, took issue, led in part by or trying to honor the wishes or listening to the wishes of the Rhinebeck Area Chamber of Commerce, led by Luciano Valdivia of Market Street Restaurant. There have been other issues, though, in addition. So, for example, there is a proposal to run a microtransit system in the village of Rhinebeck, and there's some concern by the town that they're already doing something like that. So there's been tension there. And as we are going to report early in 2026, I believe, there is now another issue which has to do with the apportionment of expense to cover fire services. So the town of Rhinebeck, like all towns, is not allowed to field a fire department. So the town contracts with the village in Rhinebeck for fire service. They also contract with Hillside, another fire department. And there is now concern that has been raised by the supervisor, again, Ms. Spinzia, that perhaps this allocation is not fair. Now, they've signed a contract in Rhinebeck, so nothing would probably happen immediately over that, but she's raising this and surfacing this as an issue. So there are tensions at play between town and village government. It is a rather odd system for governing that we see in New York State. So we'll see how these issues play out in 2026 as well. I have no crystal ball, but I don't think that the tension between the village and the town in Rhinebeck is going to calm anytime soon.
I just want to emphasize one thing you said, Emily. This demarcation of village and town, which is all over New York State, creates a lot of problems. It creates tension between the two different sets of government. It creates confusion on the part of residents. In Rhinebeck, for example, the village hall and the town hall are virtually next to each other, but you don't go into one when you should go into the other. There's no real comment here other than to say it creates this unusual series of problems. We've seen them in Red Hook, we've seen them in Rhinebeck.
That's right. For example, in Red Hook, a big issue, this is not one of our top three, but it perhaps should be, the whole issue about wastewater treatment, which centered in the village this year, but is now going to become a relevant issue for the town as the town hopes to run the sewer line down Broadway and will need to rely on the wastewater treatment plant in the village, right? So cooperation is very important, and agreement and alignment is very important to advance many of these important infrastructure projects.
Great. So those were our top three stories of the year. It's been a busy year. And now, Emily, it's time to announce our first ever Newsmaker of the year. Why don't you give listeners just some context into how you and I came up with our Newsmaker of the year?
All right. Well, I first want to say, Walter, hats off to you for coming up with the idea. You know, it takes a certain amount of confidence to feel that our institution, the Daily Catch, is important enough, has enough of an imprimatur in the community to actually have that bold confidence to name a Newsmaker of the year. Don't you think, Walter?
I agree.
So what were our standards? Well, I think we decided that a few certain key criteria. This person, or as we're going to announce, people, need to be people of leadership, people of influence, so that this appointment is a mirror held up to history. This person may be controversial, but they have most influenced the news and the course of events in our community in this year. I want to stress, moral virtue is not required to be Newsmaker of the Year. I hope that our discussion and our selection will be discussed at holiday parties. I hope our discussion and our selection will be on the lips of our leaders. I hope people will aspire to be next year's Newsmaker of the Year. But they must understand that this is about impact, not approval.
Right. It's people who found themselves in the headlines, captured the attention of readers, and got everyone talking. So I think it's time
It must embody tension, Walter. If it's not something that created tension, if it's not somebody who can shape outcomes, who has the power to shape outcomes or the power to shape reactions, then this person doesn't deserve to be nominated or honored in this way.
So would you please tell us, Emily, who is our Newsmaker, or in this case, our Newsmakers of the year?
Our Newsmaker of the year is Red Hook Town Supervisor Robert McKeon, and our second Newsmaker of the year is his foil, Commodore of the Boat Club, Richie Ross.
Probably an obvious choice, but I think putting them together also points to the impact of the story and how they really have been joined at the hip this year. It's almost a Shakespearean story watching the two of them maneuver through this issue.
I think we should talk a little bit about Richie Ross and why he's a very important Newsmaker of the year. You know, Robert McKeon couldn't be Newsmaker if there wasn't a fight, right? If there was no fight and Robert McKeon simply announced that he wanted to take the boat club by eminent domain and he lined up the votes and no one opposed it, that would not have been our story of the year. Commodore Richie Ross, a local dentist with a family and generations of history at the boat club through his own family, stood up and organized his membership to oppose this eminent domain action. So we have a real fight on our hands, and it takes people to fight. I'm reminded, Walter, of a childhood story I read my children when they were little about Ferdinand the Bull. And Ferdinand the Bull couldn't get into that matador ring because he was too afraid. Well, he got in there and he said, you know what? I'm not going to fight. So there wasn't a bullfight if there's not a bull willing to fight. And I think that's a very wonderful metaphor for what we have here. We have a man who initiated a fight and a man who fought back and is fighting back. And they make up our pair of Newsmakers of the Year.
Fantastic. Well, Emily, it's been fun recapping the top stories of 2025 with you, and I have no doubt we'll have many more things to talk about in 2026. This concludes our special year-end episode of A Catch-Up. If you like our broadcast, please be sure to subscribe or follow on your favorite platform, and you'll be notified every time we drop a new show. We need to say a big thank you to Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud at Radio Free Rhinecilff for all their help this year in producing our 36 episodes. And thank you to Esther Martell for her help with editing. Emily, have a happy new year, and it's always a pleasure to catch up with you.
Can't wait to see you again in 2026.